I was just trying to help organize the space, Mom.
By throwing everything away. I find that very hard to believe. No, Mom, wait! Don't touch that! What is it? What are you hiding from me?
I came home expecting the comforting smell of old books and the quiet that had always welcomed me. Instead, I found every bookshelf in my house stripped bare. More than 1,000 books, my life's collection, had been packed into storage without my permission. My son Michael smiled and said, "Mom, I'm just helping you simplify." Then I noticed it. One old leather journal still resting alone on the shelf. As I reached for it, Michael's face drained of color and he rushed toward me so quickly that I knew the little journal held a secret far greater than I had ever imagined. If you've ever discovered something that changed the way you looked at your own family, I'd love to hear your story. Please like this video, subscribe if you enjoy heartfelt family dramas, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I read every comment, and I'd truly love to hear your thoughts. The silence inside my house felt unfamiliar, not because there were no sounds. The refrigerator still hummed in the kitchen. Rain tapped gently against the living room windows. Somewhere outside, a dog barked twice before everything settled back into the peaceful Portland afternoon. No. The silence came from something much deeper. Books absorb sound. They soften a room. They carry memories that somehow make a house feel alive even when no one is speaking. Now every wall echoed. I stood in front of the empty shelves for what felt like hours, running my fingertips across the smooth oak wood my husband had polished by hand years ago. Dust outlined the places where hundreds of books had rested for decades. Each empty rectangle felt like a missing piece of my own life. Michael watched me from across the room. "I know this is a surprise," he said carefully, "but you'll thank me eventually." I turned toward him. "Will I?" He sighed, already sounding exhausted, as though I were the unreasonable one. "Mom, you're 68. I smiled sadly. "I know exactly how old I am. You just had knee surgery. Yes. You shouldn't be climbing ladders to reach books anymore." "I've never climbed a ladder for my books." "Well," he rubbed the back of his neck. "You know what I mean." No, I didn't. Because this conversation wasn't about my knee. It wasn't about safety. And somehow I already knew that. Rebecca walked into the living room carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to Michael before offering the other to me. "I added your favorite vanilla creamer." Normally, that small gesture would have warmed my heart. Instead, it felt rehearsed, like kindness performed on cue. She glanced around the room with obvious satisfaction. "Doesn't it feel bigger?" I looked around. Bigger maybe. Better not even close. I preferred it when it looked like someone's home. Rebecca laughed softly. "It still does." "No," I answered. "It looks like a model house waiting for strangers to tour it." Her smile tightened. "You always loved those books." "I still do. But most people your age start downsizing." There it was again, that word. Downsizing, simplifying, organizing. Every explanation sounded perfectly reasonable, until you realized no one had asked the person whose life was being reorganized. Michael sat beside me. "We only packed them into storage." Without asking. "We knew you'd say no." "Exactly." He frowned. "I don't understand." "You don't understand because you never believed my answer mattered." The room became quiet again. Michael looked genuinely confused. He wasn't acting. That was the frightening part. Somewhere along the way, my son had convinced himself that making decisions for me was the same thing as caring for me. When had that happened? I honestly couldn't remember. Maybe it hadn't happened all at once. Maybe it had arrived little by little. One decision, then another. Until one day my opinions had quietly become optional. I carried my coffee into what had once been my library. The room had always been my favorite place in the house. Edward built every shelf himself. He was an architect by profession, but woodworking was his therapy. Every Saturday morning, he'd disappear into the garage with his radio playing old jazz. By evening, another shelf would be finished. He always measured twice, sometimes 3 times. Books deserve good homes, he'd tell me. They spend their whole lives protecting people. At the time, I thought it was simply one of Edward's charming sayings. Now those words echoed differently. Protecting people. I reached for the lone leather journal still sitting on the middle shelf. Unlike every other book, it hadn't been packed. Its brown leather cover showed years of use. The corners had softened. The spine carried tiny cracks from being opened hundreds of times. Edward had written in it nearly every evening during the last years of his life. Not a diary exactly. Not quite a notebook either. Just thoughts, ideas, quotes, little observations. Sometimes he wrote only one sentence. Sometimes 10 pages. After he passed away 4 years earlier, I couldn't bring myself to read it. It felt too personal, like opening a conversation he hadn't finished. I gently picked it up. The leather felt warm despite the cool room, almost familiar, almost alive. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Michael, you should probably rest. I'm fine. You've had a long day. So have you. He forced a smile. I'll bring the storage boxes back whenever you're ready. I nodded. Good. But maybe not all of them. I looked over my shoulder. What does that mean? He hesitated. I mean, you don't need every single book. I laughed quietly. You've never understood books. That's not fair. No. You think they're objects. They are objects. They're memories. They're printed paper. They're my life. His expression softened. I know teaching meant everything to you. It still does. I'm retired. You don't stop being a teacher because someone mails your pension check. He didn't answer. Because he couldn't. I had taught English literature for 42 years. Every novel on those shelves had once belonged to a classroom discussion. Every worn page reminded me of students who discovered parts of themselves through stories. Some had become doctors, others mechanics. One became a judge. Another wrote children's books. Every Christmas, I still received handwritten cards from former students. Not because I taught grammar, because books had taught them courage, hope, empathy. Those shelves weren't decorations. They were the map of an entire lifetime. Rebecca appeared in the doorway again. I spoke with a designer this morning. A designer? She smiled brightly. Just someone who specializes in modern interiors. I stared at her. For my house. We thought lighter colors would really increase the value. Value. There it was. The word landed differently than all the others. Not comfort, not safety, not convenience. Value. I finally understood why the empty shelves bothered Rebecca so little. She wasn't imagining my future. She was imagining a future buyer. The realization settled quietly inside me. Not anger. Not yet. Just disappointment. I suddenly remembered something Edward once said while building these very shelves. If anyone ever tries to convince you that memories take up too much space, he had smiled without looking up from his work. They're probably trying to make room for something else. At the time, I laughed. Now I wasn't laughing. That evening, Michael and Rebecca left after insisting they would return the following weekend. The house finally belonged to me again, or at least it felt that way. I carried the leather journal upstairs to my bedroom. Instead of opening it, I placed it carefully inside the top drawer of my nightstand. Somehow I wasn't ready. Not yet. I changed into my pajamas, turned off the bedroom lamp, and lay awake staring at the ceiling. Around midnight, I realized I'd forgotten my reading glasses downstairs. As I quietly walked toward the staircase, voices drifted up from the kitchen. Michael and Rebecca. They had come back. I froze before they could see me. Rebecca whispered, her voice barely audible. Are you absolutely sure she hasn't opened the journal? Michael answered just as quietly. No. A long pause followed. Then Rebecca spoke again. Because if she reads what's inside before we find what your father left. Her sentence stopped abruptly. I heard footsteps. And in that moment, standing alone in the darkness of my own home, I realized this had never been about my books. It had always been about that journal. I didn't sleep at all that night. Rebecca's whispered words echoed through my mind until dawn. If she reads what's inside before we find what your father left. They weren't guessing, they were searching. And somehow they believed Edward had hidden something valuable inside my books. For 4 years after my husband's death, I had grieved him. Michael apparently had been hunting for a secret. Those two realizations refused to exist peacefully beside each other. By 7 the next morning, I was already dressed. The house still looked hollow. Every time I walked past the empty bookshelves, I felt as if someone had removed photographs from a family album and left only blank frames behind. I made myself a simple breakfast toast and black coffee, but barely touched either. Instead, I drove to the storage facility on the east side of Portland. The young clerk smiled politely as he handed me the key. Unit 214, Mrs. Hayes. Thank you. The steel door rattled upward. Hundreds of cardboard boxes filled the narrow unit. Each one carried Michael's neat handwriting. Living room history classics, poetry reference. He had organized everything perfectly. Ironically, that made it hurt even more. This wasn't something done in anger. It had been carefully planned. I opened the first box. Charles Dickens, Harper Lee, Louisa May Alcott, Jane Austen. Their familiar covers greeted me like old friends finally returning home. I smiled despite myself. I've missed you. It sounded ridiculous talking to books. Edward would have laughed. Then he would have answered, "They've missed you too." I spent nearly 2 hours unpacking random boxes simply to reassure myself that everything was still there. Most of it was. Then I noticed something strange. Inside an old copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, there should have been a faded photograph of Michael at age 9, proudly holding the first trophy he had ever won. The photograph was gone. I frowned. Perhaps it had slipped into another box. I kept looking. Inside my worn copy of Little Women, there had always been a birthday card Edward wrote me on our 20th anniversary. Gone. Next came my leather-bound Shakespeare collection. Hidden inside Hamlet was a newspaper clipping about my retirement ceremony. Missing. I sat down on one of the storage boxes. One missing keepsake could be an accident. 3 was not. Someone had opened these books, carefully, systematically. I began checking more volumes. A pressed maple leaf from our honeymoon. Gone. A handwritten recipe from my grandmother. Gone. A postcard Edward mailed me during a business trip to Boston. Gone. The books remained. The memories inside them had disappeared. A cold ache settled in my chest. Michael hadn't simply packed my library. He had searched it. Every page, every cover, every hidden place he thought his father might have used. I suddenly remembered how meticulous Edward had always been. He never used bank safes. He never trusted obvious hiding places. If something matters, he'd often say, "Hide it somewhere nobody values anymore." Books. People stopped valuing books. Perhaps that was exactly why Michael believed the answer had to be there. I closed another box when I heard footsteps behind me. "Grandma?" I turned around. Emma stood in the doorway. She wore her school backpack and looked completely out of breath. "Emma," she smiled nervously. "I skipped first period." I blinked. "You what?" "I know." She looked embarrassed. "I've never done that before. What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you." I immediately pulled her into a hug. She smelled faintly of vanilla shampoo and the cinnamon gum she always chewed before school. "I was worried about you." She held me tightly. "I'm worried about you too." We sat together on 2 unopened boxes. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, she whispered, "I'm sorry." "For what?" "My parents." I looked at her carefully. "You don't have to apologize for adults." "I know." Her eyes filled with tears. "But I watched them." A chill moved through me. Watch them do what? They went through every single book. I didn't answer. I simply waited. Emma took a deep breath. "It started while you were still in the hospital. They brought all the books into the dining room. They opened every one. They shook them. They looked inside the covers. They even flipped through every page. My hand slowly tightened around the edge of the cardboard box. Did they tell you why? She nodded. They thought Grandpa hid something. What exactly? I don't know. She looked down at her shoes. Dad kept saying. She hesitated. What? Keep looking. Dad had to leave clues somewhere. My heartbeat became louder. So they believed Grandpa left something inside the books. She nodded again. I asked Mom what they were looking for. What did she say? Emma's face hardened in a way no 16-year-olds should. She told me to mind my own business. The disappointment in her voice hurt almost as much as the story itself. I gently reached for her hand. You came here because you wanted me to know. I didn't think they were telling you everything. She looked directly into my eyes. And Grandma? Yes. They were scared. Scared. Not of you, she swallowed. They were scared they wouldn't find it before you came home. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Outside rain drummed softly against the metal roof of the storage building. Emma reached into her backpack. I almost forgot. She pulled out a folded piece of paper. I found this under the dining room table after they finished packing. I unfolded it carefully. Most of the paper was blank. Only 4 words had been written in blue ink. Journal, shelf, original place. Nothing else. No signature. No explanation. My pulse quickened. Edward's handwriting. I knew it instantly. It was impossible to mistake. The slight slant. The unusually long letter Y. The precise spacing. Emma watched my expression. Is that Grandpa's writing? Yes. Does it mean anything? I stared at the words. Journal, shelf, original place. Then I suddenly remembered something that had happened nearly 6 months before Edward died. We had been cleaning the attic together. He was carrying an old box of notebooks when he suddenly smiled. If anyone ever betrays you, Francis. I laughed because the sentence sounded so dramatic. He laughed too. Then he finished it. The answer will already be inside this house. At the time, I assumed he meant memories, or love, or faith. Now, I wasn't so sure. Emma interrupted my thoughts. Grandma? Yes. Do you think Grandpa knew this would happen? I wanted to tell her no. I wanted to believe my husband never imagined his own son would search through his mother's belongings looking for hidden wealth. But the note in my hands, the journal left on the shelf, the missing keepsakes, none of those felt accidental anymore. I carefully folded the paper and slipped it into my purse. I think your grandfather understood people better than most of us. Emma nodded slowly. I miss him. So do I. As we stood to leave, I looked back one last time at the mountain of sealed boxes surrounding us. Thousands of stories, hundreds of memories. Yet someone had searched every single one because they believed money was hidden inside. Edward had once told his students during a volunteer reading program, the quickest way to discover someone's character is to watch what they choose to search for. At the time, I thought he was talking about literature, walking out of that storage unit beside my granddaughter. I began to fear he had been talking about something much larger. And somewhere inside my quiet house, one old leather journal was still waiting for me. That afternoon, after Emma returned to school, I drove home with more questions than answers. The folded note Edward had written rested inside my purse like it weighed 100 pounds. Journal, shelf, original place. 4 simple words. 4 words my husband had never expected anyone else to read. For years after Edward died, I had avoided touching the journal. I told myself it was because I respected his privacy. The truth was far simpler. Reading it would have made his absence feel real. As long as the journal remained closed, some part of me could still pretend he was downstairs making coffee humming Frank Sinatra while reading the morning newspaper. Grief has strange habits. Sometimes it hides inside unopened drawers. Sometimes inside unwritten letters. Sometimes inside a leather journal waiting patiently on a bookshelf. When I unlocked the front door, the house greeted me with the same hollow silence. The empty shelves still felt wrong. I set my purse on the kitchen counter and walked straight upstairs. The journal remained exactly where I had left it inside my nightstand drawer. I picked it up carefully. The leather smelled faintly of cedar, the same scent that always clung to Edward's workshop. For several minutes, I simply held it. Then I opened the first page. Edward's handwriting immediately filled the paper. Neat, deliberate, comfortingly familiar. The first entries weren't mysterious at all. They were ordinary moments. Francis laughed today because I burned another grilled cheese. The roses finally bloomed near the back fence. Michael called, busy as always. Emma lost her first tooth and insisted the tooth fairy should pay extra because it was a front one. I smiled despite the knot in my chest. This wasn't a coded notebook. It was a husband preserving little moments he didn't want time to steal. I continued reading. Weeks passed through the pages, then months. Edward wrote about books he loved, neighbors, weather, politics, small repairs around the house. Nothing about hidden fortunes, nothing about secret documents, nothing that explained why Michael seemed terrified of the journal. After nearly an hour, I closed it again. Perhaps Rebecca had been wrong. Perhaps Michael had searched for something that never existed. I leaned back in my chair. The room suddenly reminded me of another afternoon nearly 5 years earlier. Edward had been sitting across from me at this very kitchen table, organizing stacks of paperwork. You know, I teased him, if you keep filing everything this carefully, someday I'll never find anything. Without looking up, he smiled. Oh, you'll find exactly what matters. And what about everything else? The unimportant things can stay lost. At the time, I thought he was joking. Now I wasn't so sure. The doorbell interrupted my thoughts. When I opened the door, I found Charles Bennett standing on the porch. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him. His silver hair had thinned considerably, and he leaned lightly on a polished wooden cane, but his eyes remained as sharp as ever. Francis. Charles, he smiled warmly. I hope I'm not interrupting. You never do. I invited him inside. Charles had been more than Edward's attorney. He had been his closest friend since law school. The two men played golf terribly together. Every summer argued endlessly about baseball and somehow managed to remain best friends, despite supporting rival college football teams. After Edward's funeral, Charles checked on me every few months. Never intrusively, just enough to remind me I wasn't alone. We settled into the living room, or what used to be the living room. Charles looked around slowly. His eyebrows rose. What happened to your library? My son happened. He studied the empty shelves without speaking. Finally, he sighed. I was afraid something like this might happen. His words caught my attention immediately. What do you mean? Instead of answering, he asked a question. Has Michael mentioned Montana recently? I blinked. Montana. He nodded. Or perhaps an old family property. I searched my memory. No. Not once. No. Charles leaned back thoughtfully. For several seconds he stared toward the empty bookshelves. Then he quietly asked, You remember your father's land? My father's. I frowned. You mean the 80 acres outside Bozeman? Yes. I thought it was sold decades ago. Did you? His expression remained impossible to read. Charles. He folded his hands. What exactly do you remember? I closed my eyes for a moment. My father inherited that land from his uncle. He never farmed it. It was mostly forest. When Dad died, Edward handled all the paperwork. I assumed everything was sold. Charles slowly nodded. That is what everyone believed. Everyone. Not everything. The wording felt deliberate. A knot tightened in my stomach. Charles. He looked directly into my eyes. Was it sold? He hesitated. I can't answer that. Why not? Because I made Edward a promise. I almost laughed. My husband has been gone 4 years. I know. And you're still keeping promises to him. I intend to until the day I die. His voice carried no hesitation whatsoever. That answer alone told me how serious this was. I stood and walked toward the empty bookshelves. I don't understand. I know. I've spent 4 years believing Edward told me everything. He told you almost everything. Almost. Charles sighed deeply. Edward knew people. He especially understood family. He also understood temptation. I turned around. You're speaking in riddles. I wish I weren't. Silence settled between us. Finally, I asked the question that had haunted me since hearing Rebecca whisper the previous night. Was Edward hiding something? Charles didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the staircase leading upstairs. Do you still have his journal? My heart skipped. Yes. Did Michael know that? I don't think so. Charles nodded slowly. Good. Why? Another long silence. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small white envelope. He placed it gently on the coffee table. Written across the front were 5 words. For Francis. Only if necessary. My breath caught. Edward's handwriting again. When did he write this? About 6 months before he passed. You've had this all this time. Yes. Why didn't you give it to me after the funeral? Because he specifically instructed me not to. I stared at the envelope without touching it. What exactly did he say? Charles answered from memory. If Francis ever asks about Montana, or if someone begins searching my books, then you'll know the time has come. The room suddenly felt colder. He knew. Charles gave the slightest nod. He didn't know what would happen. But he believed something eventually would. I looked toward the staircase again, toward the bedroom where the journal rested, toward the shelves where Michael had deliberately left only one book untouched. My voice became barely more than a whisper. The journal. Charles followed my gaze. Yes. What is it? He slowly rose from his chair. I can't tell you. Frustration finally escaped me. Charles, people have gone through every book in my house. My son has been searching for something. My granddaughter is frightened. And you're telling me you still can't explain any of this? His expression softened. I can explain one thing. I waited. Edward gave me a look I had seen countless times before in difficult legal cases, calm, certain, unmovable. He told me there would come a day when only one person would understand why that journal was left on the shelf. And who is that? Charles smiled gently. You. He walked toward the front door. Before leaving, he paused with his hand on the knob. Without turning around, he quietly said, Francis. Yes. The answers you're looking for aren't hidden inside the journal. I frowned. Then where are they? He finally looked back at me. The journal will teach you where to look. The front door closed behind him. I remained standing in the silent house, staring at the envelope Edward had left behind. Upstairs, the leather journal waited. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized I hadn't been asking the right question. It wasn't what Edward had hidden. It was why he had expected someone to go looking for it. I stared at the envelope for nearly 10 minutes before I finally picked it up. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but Edward's handwriting remained as steady as ever. For Francis, only if necessary. My fingers traced each letter. He had written my name the same way for 47 years. Every birthday card, every anniversary note, every grocery list he left on the refrigerator. There was something comforting about seeing it again, and something terrifying. Because Edward had never been a dramatic man. If he had labeled an envelope only if necessary, then he must have believed there would come a day when I truly needed it. Was that day finally here? I carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored stationery. No legal language, no financial records, just a handwritten letter. My dearest Francis, if you're reading this, something happened that I prayed never would. Please don't be afraid. My eyes blurred instantly. I stopped reading for a moment, wiping away tears before continuing. First, I need you to remember something important. Never mistake curiosity for guilt. Someone may search our home. Someone may search our books. Someone may even search my journal. That does not necessarily make them evil. Sometimes fear and greed wear the same face. I slowly lowered the page. Fear and greed. Edward had always believed those two emotions traveled together. He often told his students that fear made people protect what they had, while greed convinced them they deserved more. I continued reading. You will probably wonder why I left the journal on the shelf. The answer is simple. It was never meant to hide anything. It was meant to attract attention. My heartbeat quickened. So Michael had done exactly what Edward expected. He had focused on the journal. Edward continued. If someone spends all their energy looking at the journal, they won't notice what the journal quietly points toward. That sentence puzzled me. Points toward, I read it again. Then again. The journal wasn't the destination. It was a map. I folded the letter carefully and carried both it and the journal back to the kitchen table. Sunlight poured through the window. For the first time, instead of reading the journal as a grieving widow, I began reading it as if Edward had intentionally written it for someone trying to solve a puzzle. I started from the beginning again. The entries still appeared ordinary. Weather, gardening, books, neighborhood walks, family dinners, nothing unusual. Then I noticed something I had completely ignored before. Edward always dated every entry, except once. Near the middle of the journal, one page contained no date at all. Instead, he had written only a quotation. Some stories begin where others stop looking. That was unlike him. Edward loved quotations, but he always credited the author. This one had no attribution. I flipped forward. 30 pages later, another undated entry appeared. A shelf can hold more than books. I frowned. Another strange sentence. No explanation. No date. My pulse began to quicken. I grabbed a notepad and began listing every undated page. There were 7, only 7 in the entire journal. Each contained a single sentence. Some stories begin where others stop looking. A shelf can hold more than books. Wood remembers every hand that shaped it. The strongest foundation is the one nobody notices. Truth rarely sits in the center. Count carefully. Original place. Original place. The same words from the note Emma had found. I pushed my chair back. Edward wasn't writing random thoughts. He was leaving breadcrumbs. My eyes drifted toward the empty library, toward the shelves he had built with his own hands. Wood remembers every hand that shaped it. The strongest foundation is the one nobody notices. Count carefully. Original place. None of those sentences mentioned money. None mentioned land. None mentioned legal papers. They all mentioned one thing: the shelves. I walked into the library. The room felt even emptier in the afternoon light. Without the books, every shelf was fully visible. Every screw, every joint, every piece of oak. I slowly ran my hand along the middle bookshelf. Edward had built these himself 25 years earlier. Not purchased them, built them. I crouched down. The baseboards looked normal. The brackets appeared solid. Still, something about the center shelf seemed slightly different. I couldn't explain why. Perhaps because I had dusted these shelves thousands of times. Without realizing it, I knew every inch of them. I counted. 1 shelf, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then I remembered. Count carefully. I counted again. The left wall contained 6 shelves. The right wall also contained 6. The center section, only 5. That couldn't be right. Edward believed symmetry was beautiful. He would never intentionally build mismatched shelves. Unless one wasn't actually visible. I stepped backward. The afternoon sunlight entered through the west-facing window. A thin beam landed directly across the empty oak panels. Something caught my eye. A faint difference in color. Almost invisible. A narrow rectangle about 12 inches wide. It disappeared as soon as a cloud covered the sun. I waited. Several seconds later, the sunlight returned. There it was again. A tiny variation in the wood grain. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for Edward to notice. Enough for me. I touched it gently. Nothing happened. I pressed harder. Still nothing. I laughed quietly. You're making me work for this, aren't you? Just then my phone rang. Michael. I stared at the screen before answering. Hi, Mom. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. How are you feeling? I'm doing well. Good. I was thinking maybe Rebecca and I could stop by tonight. My eyes never left the faint rectangle in the bookshelf. Why? Just to see how you're doing. Or to check something else. Silence. Only for a second. But I heard it. Then he laughed. What do you mean? I don't know. I chose my words carefully. I've been thinking about your father today. I found one of his letters. Another silence. Longer this time. What kind of letter? A personal one. Oh. His voice tightened almost imperceptibly. Anything. Important. There it was. Not how touching. Not what did Dad say. Not are you okay? Just one question. Was it important? I smiled to myself. Edward had been right. The journal had attracted exactly the attention he expected. It's nothing you need to worry about. I see. I think I'd like to spend tonight alone. Of course. He sounded disappointed, almost anxious. Call me if you need anything. I will. After hanging up, I remained standing before the bookshelf. The rectangle seemed almost to disappear again. Perhaps I was imagining it. Perhaps grief was making patterns where none existed. Then I remembered another sentence. Truth rarely sits in the center. I looked away from the rectangle, toward the very edge of the bookshelf, near the floor. There, barely visible beneath decades of furniture polish, was a tiny brass screw, unlike every other one Edward had used. It had fresh scratches around it, very fresh. Someone had tried to remove it, recently. Someone had known there was something hidden inside the shelves. Someone had almost found it. I knelt on the hardwood floor, staring at that single scratched screw while one question echoed through my mind. If Michael had already searched here, why had he walked away empty-handed? I remained kneeling on the hardwood floor long after the phone call ended. The tiny brass screw gleamed in the late afternoon sunlight. Every other screw Edward had used throughout the library was steel. This one was brass. Edward hated inconsistency. If he had chosen a different screw, he had done it for a reason. I reached into the drawer of the nearby desk and found one of his old precision screwdrivers. He had owned dozens of them, carefully arranged by size, inside a wooden case he had built himself. As I held the screwdriver in my hand, I could almost hear his voice. Never force old wood, Frankie. He had been the only person who ever called me Frankie. It remembers every mistake. I smiled through tears. Let's hope it remembers the right ones. The brass screw turned surprisingly easily. One rotation, then another, then another. Unlike the others, it never came completely out. Instead, I heard a faint click somewhere inside the bookshelf. I stopped moving. The room fell silent. Nothing happened. I gently pressed against the side panel. Solid. I tried the shelf above it. Nothing. Then I remembered another sentence from the journal. Truth rarely sits in the center. I walked to the opposite side of the library. The matching bookshelf looked identical. I crouched again. There it was. Another brass screw, hidden beneath years of furniture polish. Edward had balanced everything. Of course he had. I turned the second screw. Another quiet click echoed through the oak frame. Suddenly, somewhere behind the center shelves, a soft wooden thump broke the silence. I stood immediately. The sound had come from the middle section, not from the side. Slowly, I placed both hands against the wide center panel beneath the lowest shelf. This time it shifted, barely half an inch. I stared at it in disbelief. Edward had built a concealed compartment into the library itself, not behind the shelves, inside them. The hidden panel slid sideways with remarkable smoothness, despite not having been opened in years. Inside was a narrow cavity, no more than 4 inches deep. It was empty. My heart sank. For a brief moment, disappointment overwhelmed me. Michael had found it. He had taken whatever Edward had hidden. Then I looked closer. Dust covered almost every surface inside the compartment, except for one clean rectangular outline. Something had indeed rested there for years, something about the size of a legal envelope. But the dust told another story. The clean outline ended nearly an inch before the back wall. I reached farther inside. My fingertips touched smooth wood. Then, another surface. I frowned. The compartment had a false back. Edward. Even now, he was one step ahead. Carefully, I examined the rear panel. There were no hinges, no visible latch, nothing. Only a tiny carved symbol in one corner. A maple leaf. My breath caught. The missing maple leaf. Earlier that morning, I had discovered that the pressed maple leaf Edward and I had collected during our honeymoon had disappeared from my copy of Little Women. At the time, I assumed Michael had accidentally thrown it away while searching. Now I wasn't so sure. Edward loved repeating symbols. The maple leaf had always meant something special to us. We met in October. We married in October. Every anniversary we visited the Columbia River Gorge to watch the leaves change. He called autumn our season of beginnings. I gently pressed the carved maple leaf. Nothing. Then I traced its outline with my thumb. The stem moved slightly. Another click. The false panel released. Behind it lay nothing. Completely empty. I sat back against the bookshelf. For several seconds I simply stared. Michael had definitely found this place. He had emptied it. Otherwise, why would there be two hidden compartments? Why would the second one also be vacant? Frustration tightened my chest. I had been too late. Edward's secret, whatever it had been, was gone. I almost closed everything again when something white caught my eye. Wedged tightly into the upper corner of the second compartment was a tiny folded strip of paper no larger than my little finger. I carefully pulled it free. It wasn't an envelope. It wasn't a document. Just a narrow scrap. Edward's handwriting. Only 6 words. The journal knows what envelopes cannot. I read them 3 times. The journal knows what envelopes cannot. Not contains. Not hides. Knows. Edward was choosing his words deliberately. He wasn't telling me to keep searching compartments. He was sending me back to the journal. I closed both hidden panels exactly as I had found them. No one else needed to know I had discovered them, especially not Michael. As evening settled over, Portland rain began falling again. I made myself soup but never finished it. Instead, I carried the journal to the dining room table, along with a magnifying glass, several pencils, and a notebook. If Edward believed the journal held answers, then I had missed something. Hours passed. I examined every page, margins, corners, the inside covers, the stitching along the spine. Nothing. Around 9 o'clock my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, Helen Carter stood on the porch holding a small casserole dish wrapped in a kitchen towel. "I figured you hadn't cooked." I smiled warmly. "You know me too well." She stepped inside. "I also figured you might need company." Helen had lived next door for 33 years. She and Edward argued over tomato plants every summer. She insisted talking to plants helped them grow. Edward insisted they responded only to proper watering. Neither ever convinced the other. She noticed the journal immediately. "So you finally opened it?" I nodded. "I think Edward wanted me to." Helen sat quietly. After a moment she asked, "Has Michael been back?" "Not today." She hesitated. "I've been wondering whether to tell you something." My attention sharpened. "What is it?" She looked toward the window as rain streaked down the glass. "While you were in the hospital?" "Yes. I saw Michael. Here." She nodded. "More than once." "Doing what?" "He came over after dark." My stomach tightened. I assumed he was checking on the house. "So did I." She paused. "But the third night, what happened?" I couldn't sleep. I looked outside around 2 in the morning. "He was in your attic." I frowned. "My attic?" The light was on. "For almost 3 hours." Edward's workshop had been in the attic. His drafting table, his woodworking plans, old blueprints, boxes filled with decades of notebooks. "Are you certain?" Helen nodded without hesitation. "I even walked over to ask if everything was all right." "What did he say?" "He told me he was looking for old tax papers." I slowly shook my head. "Tax papers weren't in the attic." "I know." Helen reached across the table and gently touched my hand. "Francis." "Yes. I've known Michael since he was 10. So have I. I've never seen him look the way he did that night." "What do you mean?" "He wasn't angry. He wasn't grieving. He looked, she searched for the right word, desperate. That word lingered in the room long after she spoke it. Desperate people make dangerous decisions. Desperate people stop thinking clearly. After Helen left, I locked the front door and returned to the journal once more. Desperate. Michael had searched every book. He had searched the hidden compartments. He had searched the attic. He had even removed keepsakes from between pages. Yet he still hadn't found what he believed existed, which meant one of two things. Either Edward had hidden his secret somewhere no one had looked, or Michael had already found it without realizing what it truly was. As I absent-mindedly turned another page of the journal, something unexpected happened. A tiny shimmer flashed across the paper beneath the warm light of my antique desk lamp. I froze. When I tilted the page, the shimmer disappeared. I tilted it again. There it was. Not ink, not pencil. Something almost invisible. A faint line stretching diagonally across the margin. I quickly turned off the desk lamp. The shimmer vanished. I switched the lamp back on. It returned. Edward hadn't written only with ink. Somewhere inside this journal, hidden under the right light, another message was waiting to be discovered. I carried the journal to the brightest window in the house the next morning. The faint shimmer I had noticed beneath the desk lamp refused to leave my mind. Edward had loved puzzles. Not childish riddles, but the kind that rewarded patience instead of cleverness. Whenever one of my literature students complained that a novel was confusing, Edward always smiled and said, "The best stories never hurry to introduce themselves." Perhaps he had written this journal the same way. I opened to the page where I had first seen the strange reflection. Under ordinary daylight, it looked completely normal. Black ink, cream-colored paper, nothing unusual. I tilted it toward the sun. There. A pale silver line appeared across the margin before disappearing again. Not ink, not pencil, almost like someone had lightly brushed the paper with clear varnish. I hurried into the kitchen and filled a kettle. Years earlier, Edward and I had attended a historical preservation workshop at a museum. One of the demonstrations involved hidden writing that became visible under gentle heat. I wasn't certain this was the same thing, but it was worth trying. Once the kettle released a thin stream of steam, I carefully held the page several inches above it. Nothing. I moved it a little closer. Still nothing. Then very slowly, faint brown letters began appearing in the margin. My breath caught. Edward. He had written between the printed lines using invisible ink. The hidden sentence was only 4 words long. Begin with the indexes. I quickly turned to the first page. There was no index, at least not the kind found in ordinary books. Then I remembered. Edward had always created his own indexes. Every notebook he ever owned contained a small, handwritten list tucked inside the back cover. I flipped to the final page. Sure enough, inside the back cover was a sheet glued neatly into place. It looked like an ordinary reading log. Book titles, dates, page numbers. Nothing remarkable. Until I looked closer. The page numbers didn't match the books. For example, The Old Man and the Sea, page 18, except page 18, contained no mention of Hemingway. The next entry read, Walden, page 94. Again, page 94 had nothing to do with Walden. Edward wasn't creating a reading list. He was creating directions. I copied every title and corresponding page number into my notebook. There were 12 entries. Each led to a different page in the journal. As I turned to page 18, I immediately noticed another invisible sentence emerging after a little steam. Second shelf. Third board. Page 94 revealed another. Measure from the fireplace. Every indexed page contained another short instruction. None of them made sense by themselves, but together they began forming something remarkably precise. Second shelf, third board, measure from the fireplace, 32 inches, left corner, original nails, north wall. I stopped writing. The library. These weren't literary references, they were construction notes. Edward hadn't hidden instructions inside the journal. He had hidden a blueprint. Just then my phone buzzed. Emma. Grandma. Her voice sounded nervous. Are you all right? I am. What's wrong? She hesitated. I think Dad knows you're looking for something. I stood very still. What happened? I wasn't supposed to hear. Hear what? He was arguing with Mom this morning. I listened carefully. He kept saying, she's figured out more than we expected. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. Did he say anything else? Emma lowered her voice. He wants to come over tonight. I know. He said if the journal is still there, they'll have one more chance. One more chance. I thanked Emma for warning me and ended the call. For several minutes, I simply stared at the journal. Michael wasn't giving up. Whatever he believed existed, he was becoming increasingly desperate to find it first. I folded Edward's letter and slipped it into a folder with my notes. Then I drove across town to see Charles Bennett. His office occupied the second floor of an old brick building downtown. The receptionist smiled when she recognized me. Mrs. Hayes, Mr. Bennett is expecting you. Expecting me, Charles looked up as I entered. I had a feeling you'd come today. You knew I'd discover the hidden writing. A small smile crossed his face. I knew Edward. I placed my notebook on his desk. He left instructions. Charles adjusted his glasses and examined the copied notes without speaking. Finally, he nodded. Good. Good. I was hoping the ink still worked after all these years. You knew about this. I knew he experimented with invisible ink. You didn't think that information would have been useful yesterday. Charles chuckled softly. If I'd told you, you would have trusted me. I do trust you. I know. He leaned back. But Edward wanted you to trust your own judgment first. I couldn't argue with that. He pointed toward my notebook. Have you followed all the instructions? Not yet. Good. That answer surprised me. You don't want me to. I want you to wait. Why? Because someone else is still searching. He looked directly into my eyes. Let them keep searching in the wrong places. I slowly understood. The journal. Exactly. They're focused on the journal. And while they're watching the journal, Charles finished my sentence. They aren't watching you. I smiled for the first time in days. Edward had planned every layer with astonishing care. The journal wasn't merely a clue, it was a distraction, a deliberate one. Charles opened a drawer and removed a small envelope. This belongs to you now. Inside was a brass key no longer than my thumb. No label, no markings. What does it open? I honestly don't know. You don't? Edward shook his head. Edward never told me. He only said you would know when the time came, another mystery, another piece waiting for its place. When I returned home late that afternoon, Michael's SUV was already parked in my driveway. My pulse quickened. He wasn't supposed to arrive for another hour. Before I could step out of my car, my front door opened. Michael smiled as though nothing unusual had happened. Mom, what are you doing here? I wanted to surprise you. His smile never reached his eyes. I used the spare key. I looked past him into the house. The living room appeared normal, too normal, almost carefully arranged. Then I noticed it. The journal. It was no longer on the dining room table where I had left it. It sat neatly back on the library shelf, exactly where it had been before. Michael followed my gaze. I figured you'd want it back where Dad always kept it. Our eyes met. Neither of us spoke. For a brief moment, I realized we were both pretending. He pretended he had simply tidied the room. I pretended I believed him. But one thought echoed louder than every other. If Michael had moved the journal, then while I was away, he had been inside my house, searching again. And this time, I had no idea what else he might have touched. For a long moment, neither Michael nor I moved. He stood in the middle of my living room with the confidence of someone who believed he still belonged there. I remained in the doorway, my purse still hanging from my shoulder, watching him carefully. The journal rested on the center shelf exactly where Edward had always kept it. Too perfectly. Michael wasn't simply cleaning, he was staging a scene. I hope you don't mind, he said with an easy smile. The journal looked out of place on the dining room table. I didn't ask you to move it. I know. He shrugged casually. I thought I was helping. Helping. That word again. Lately, it seemed to justify every decision he made without consulting me. I quietly closed the front door. When did you get here? About 20 minutes ago. You let yourself in. You gave me the spare key years ago. I gave you the key in case of emergencies. His smile faded slightly. I figured checking on you counted. I wasn't home. I know. There was another brief silence. He had answered too quickly. He hadn't come because he thought I needed help. He had come because he thought the house was empty. I placed my purse on the hallway table. Would you like some coffee? His shoulders visibly relaxed. I'd love some. As I walked toward the kitchen, I could feel his eyes following me. Edward used to say that uncomfortable conversations should happen over coffee because holding a warm mug kept people from pointing fingers. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps not. While the coffee brewed, I watched Michael's reflection in the kitchen window. He wandered slowly through the library, not browsing, observing. His gaze paused on each shelf, each wall, each corner, like a surveyor inspecting property. I carried 2 mugs into the living room. He accepted his with a grateful smile. This reminds me of Dad. It reminds me of your childhood. He looked around. I know this room means a lot to you. It used to mean something to you too. It still does. Does it? He hesitated. Of course. I looked toward the empty shelves. When was the last time you read one of these books? He laughed softly. You know I'm not much of a reader. I know. You inherited your father's love of books. I inherited your father's respect for them. He lowered his eyes. I never meant to upset you. I believe that. His head lifted in surprise. You do. I believe you convinced yourself you were doing the right thing. His expression softened. Thank you. But believing you're right doesn't erase the consequences. His fingers tightened around the coffee mug. I've been thinking a lot since you came home. So have I. I should have asked before packing everything. Yes. I was worried about your recovery. I appreciate the concern. I just... He searched for the right words. I don't want you living alone forever. There it was. The real conversation. Not books, not shelves, the future. I've managed alone for 4 years. I know. Dad wouldn't want you isolated. I smiled sadly. Your father built this house so I'd never feel isolated. Michael looked away. The conversation drifted into another silence. Then almost casually he asked, Did you ever read Dad's journal? There it was, the question he had come to ask. I deliberately took another sip of coffee before answering. I've started. His face remained calm. Too calm. Anything interesting? I studied him carefully. When you ask that, he frowned. Are you asking as my son, or as someone looking for something? Color drained ever so slightly from his face. I don't understand. I think you do. He forced a laugh. Mom, it's just a journal. Is it? Of course. Then why were you so nervous when I reached for it the day I came home? His eyes widened. I wasn't nervous. You practically ran across the room. I just didn't want you straining your knee. I let the excuse hang in the air. Neither of us believed it. Finally, he sighed. Dad always wrote everything down. Yes. I guess I wondered what was in there. You could have asked me. I know. But asking wasn't enough. His forehead creased. What does that mean? It means someone searched every book in this house. He froze. Only for a second. Then he recovered. Maybe whoever packed them moved things around. I looked directly into his eyes. The photographs. The letters. The birthday cards. The pressed flowers. They're gone. His lips parted slightly. You searched every page. He said nothing. I know you did. Still nothing. I wasn't ready for the confrontation Charles had advised me to postpone, so I changed directions. I visited the storage unit. I figured you might. I found a lot of memories missing. I'm sorry. Were you looking for something your father left behind? His breathing slowed. He looked down into his coffee. When he finally answered, his voice had become almost a whisper. Dad always liked mysteries. That's not what I asked. He stood up and walked toward the empty bookshelves. I miss him. So do I. I keep thinking. He rested a hand against the oak shelf Edward had built. That maybe there were things he never told us. There were. He turned quickly. What do you mean? I immediately regretted saying it. Not because it wasn't true, because I had revealed more than I intended. What things? I shrugged gently. Every marriage has private conversations. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. So he left you something. I smiled. He left me 47 wonderful years. No. His voice sharpened before softening again. I mean, documents. Interesting. He hadn't asked whether Edward left money, or jewelry, or property. He asked specifically about documents. Why, before I could respond, the front door opened. Rebecca walked inside carrying a grocery bag. I brought dinner. She stopped when she saw me watching her. Oh, I didn't realize you were already home. Apparently. She set the bag on the kitchen counter and kissed Michael on the cheek. Everything about her movements felt practiced, comfortable, as though entering my home without permission had become normal. We thought we'd make lasagna. That's thoughtful, she smiled brightly. You shouldn't be cooking while you're recovering. I wasn't planning to. We're happy to help. Again, help. I thanked her politely and began setting plates on the dining table. During dinner, the conversation stayed light. Weather, Emma's school, traffic, the neighborhood. No one mentioned books. No one mentioned the journal. No one mentioned Edward. But beneath every polite sentence flowed another conversation entirely. One made of cautious glances, half-finished questions, and carefully hidden intentions. After dessert, Rebecca volunteered to wash the dishes. Michael excused himself to use the bathroom upstairs. The moment he disappeared, Rebecca quietly stepped beside me. Without looking directly at me, she asked, "So, how far have you gotten?" I continued drying a plate. "In what, the journal?" I placed the plate carefully into the cabinet. "Why are you so interested in Edward's journal?" She laughed. "I'm not. You just asked about it. I was only curious." "No." I turned to face her. "You're worried." Her smile vanished, for only an instant. Then she recovered. "I don't know what you mean." Before I could answer, footsteps sounded on the staircase. Michael returned. But something immediately caught my attention. His expression had changed. He wasn't looking at me. I was staring toward the library, toward the bookshelf, toward the exact place where I had discovered the hidden brass screw. Then our eyes met. He realized I had seen where he was looking. In that single silent moment, I no longer wondered whether Michael knew about the hidden compartment. I knew he did. The only question left was whether he had truly found everything Edward intended him to find. I didn't mention what I had seen. Not the brass screw, not the hidden compartment, not the way. Michael's eyes had drifted instinctively toward that exact section of the library. Instead, I smiled politely as they prepared to leave. Rebecca hugged me at the front door. "Call if you need anything." "I will." Michael lingered a moment longer. "If you decide to sell the house someday," I looked at him. "We'll talk." He nodded. "I just don't want you making big decisions alone." "I've been making decisions alone for 4 years." His smile faltered. Then they were gone. I stood at the front window until their SUV disappeared around the corner. Only then did I lock every door in the house. For the first time in my life, I also locked the door to my own library. Not because I feared strangers, because I no longer knew how much I should trust my own son. The following morning, I spread everything across the dining room table. Edward's journal, the hidden letter, my notebook filled with copied instructions, the tiny brass key Charles had given me, a yellow legal pad, a ruler, 3 sharpened pencils. If Edward had spent months preparing this trail, I wasn't going to rush through it. I reread every hidden instruction. Second shelf, third board, measure from the fireplace, 32 inches, north wall, original nails. Count carefully, None of them mentioned a bank, none mentioned money, yet every instruction described the library with remarkable precision. I fetched Edward's old tape measure from the garage. The familiar yellow tool still had his initials, EH, written in black marker near the handle. I smiled. He labeled everything. I measured exactly 32 inches from the stone fireplace toward the north wall. The measurement stopped at the center bookshelf, exactly where the hidden compartment had been. I measured again. Same result. Then I noticed something I had completely overlooked. Edward hadn't written, measure 32 inches. He had written 32. Original nails, not inches, just 32. I walked closer to the bookshelf. Original nails. Edward had once explained the difference between decorative screws and finishing nails while building the shelves. The screws carry the weight, he had said. The nails keep everything aligned. I crouched beside the bookshelf. Tiny finishing nails lined the trim. Most were almost invisible beneath layers of stain. I began counting. 1, 2, 3. By the time I reached 21, my knees were aching. 22, 23, 24. Finally, 32. The 32nd nail sat near the lower right corner of the trim. Unlike every other nail, its head carried a tiny circular mark, almost impossible to notice. I pressed it gently. Nothing happened. I pushed harder. Still nothing. Then I remembered Edward's habit of designing mechanisms that required two actions at once. Safety isn't about locks, he used to tell his architecture students. It's about making the right sequence. I pressed the nail again while turning the hidden brass screw beneath the shelf. Click. A softer sound than before. Somewhere deeper inside the wall. Not inside the bookshelf. Behind it. My heart pounded. Carefully, I slid the concealed panel open again. The compartment still appeared empty, until I reached all the way to the back. This time, my fingertips found something that hadn't been there before. A narrow wooden drawer slowly slid forward. I stared in astonishment. The second compartment hadn't been empty at all. It contained another hidden compartment. Edward. Always another layer. Inside rested only 3 items: a small brass key, an old envelope, and a folded sheet of graph paper. No cash, no deed, no jewels, nothing that looked remotely valuable. I picked up the graph paper first. Edward had drawn a rough sketch of downtown Portland. Several familiar streets appeared. One location had been circled in red. No label, just an address. I recognized it immediately. It was the old First Columbia Bank building. The bank Edward and I had used for years before it merged with another institution. Curiously, the building had never closed. It had simply changed names. I turned to the envelope, written neatly across the front, only after you understand why. Not open immediately, not important, only after you understand why. I laughed quietly. You're still giving homework. That was Edward, always the teacher, always believing answers mattered less than understanding. The final item was another brass key. Unlike the one Charles had given me, this key carried a tiny engraved number. I frowned. 214. The number felt strangely familiar. Then it hit me. Storage Unit 214. The same storage locker holding all my books. My pulse quickened. Edward had hidden a key to a storage unit that hadn't even existed when he died. No, that couldn't be right. Unless the number wasn't referring to today's storage facility at all. I wrote it down beside the bank address. 2 unrelated clues. Or perhaps not. Around noon my phone rang. Charles. I had a feeling you'd find something today. I smiled despite myself. Are you secretly watching my house? He chuckled. No. Edward simply predicted how long it would take you. He underestimated me. He usually did. I laughed. So did I. His voice became more serious. Francis. Yes. Don't open every envelope immediately. I wasn't planning to. Good. There are reasons for the order. I've noticed. He designed it that way because people searching for money always rush. And people searching for truth, they slow down. After we hung up, I couldn't stop thinking about those words. Michael had rushed. He searched books, letters, hidden compartments, the attic. He had probably found some clues, but had he followed them, or had he skipped ahead assuming every clue led directly to money? Edward knew his son well, too well. That afternoon I decided to visit the old bank. Not to open anything, simply to look. The building stood almost unchanged from the last time Edward and I visited together. The marble floors, the brass railings, even the old clock above the entrance remained. As I stepped inside, memories flooded back. Edward depositing his paycheck after we were first married. Emma opening her first savings account. Michael receiving his first debit card before college. A young woman greeted me. "Good afternoon. How may I help you?" I smiled politely. "I actually have a question." "Of course. I used to bank here years ago." She nodded. "We've merged with Northwest Heritage Bank, but many older accounts are still maintained." I was wondering. Before I finished, an older gentleman emerged from a nearby office. He studied me for a second, then his face brightened. "Mrs. Hayes." I blinked. "Yes. I'm Richard Collins. You probably don't remember me." Then I did. Richard had worked behind the teller counter decades earlier. Now his silver hair matched mine. "My goodness," he smiled warmly. "Mr. Hayes always said you had an incredible memory." The mention of Edward made my chest tighten. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." Richard hesitated before quietly asking, "Did you finally come?" The question caught me completely off guard. "What do you mean?" He looked genuinely surprised. "Mr. Hayes told me one day you'd walk through those doors asking questions." Every muscle in my body went still. Edward hadn't only prepared Charles, he had prepared someone at the bank as well. Richard lowered his voice. "I've been waiting almost 4 years." For a moment I simply stared at Richard Collins. The bank lobby around us seemed to fade into the background as his words settled over me. "I've been waiting almost 4 years." I finally found my voice. "Edward told you I would come." Richard nodded. "He didn't know when. But he was certain that one day you'd walk through those doors." He gestured toward a private office. "Would you mind sitting down?" I followed him in silence. The office overlooked the same street where Edward and I had parked countless times over the years. Nothing outside had changed very much. Inside me, everything had. Richard closed the door before taking a seat across from me. "I've wondered about you often, Mrs. Hayes. I wondered about all of you after Mr. Hayes passed away." I smiled faintly. "He always spoke highly of you." Richard chuckled. "He mostly teased me. Every Friday he'd complain that my coffee was better than his." I laughed for the first time in days. "That sounds exactly like Edward." The laughter disappeared almost as quickly as it came. "I need to ask you something." "Anything." "Did my husband leave something here?" Richard folded his hands. "Yes." My heart began beating faster. "But before I show you anything," he reached into a drawer and removed a thin file. "There's something Mr. Hayes insisted I read to you." It wasn't another letter. Instead, it was a notarized instruction signed by Edward. Richard adjusted his glasses before reading aloud. "If my wife Frances Hayes arrives asking about my instructions, please remind her of one thing before releasing anything in my name." Richard paused and looked up. He underlined the next sentence. He continued reading. "The greatest mistake people make is believing they are searching for an inheritance when they are actually searching for reassurance." I felt my eyes sting. That sounded exactly like Edward. Even now he wasn't speaking about money. He was speaking about people. Richard closed the document. "He wanted you to hear that first." I nodded slowly. "What happens now?" He stood. "Now I retrieve something that has belonged to you all along." He disappeared into the vault area behind the office. Several minutes later, he returned carrying a small gray metal box. It wasn't particularly large, about the size of two hardcover novels stacked together. He placed it gently on the desk. "The account has been in your name since the day it was opened." "My name?" "Yes." "I've never opened a safety deposit box." Edward had, or so I thought. Richard smiled kindly. "He insisted on listing you as the sole owner." He pushed a document toward me. "I only need your identification." After verifying my driver's license, Richard unlocked one side of the box. He then handed me a small brass key. The other lock is yours. I looked down at the key in my hand. Not the numbered key I had found inside the bookshelf. Not the one Charles had given me. A completely different key. Edward certainly loved keys. Taking a slow breath, I inserted it into the second lock. The lid clicked open. For just a moment I hesitated. After everything Michael had done, after all the searching, part of me expected jewels, cash, property deeds, some hidden fortune capable of explaining everything. Instead, the box contained neatly bundled letters, dozens of them, each tied together with blue ribbon. Nothing else. No gold, no stock certificates, no land deeds, only letters. Richard quietly excused himself, giving me privacy. When the door closed, I picked up the first bundle. The top envelope read, "To Francis, Year 1. The second bundle, Year 2, then Year 3. There was one bundle for every year after Edward's death, including one labeled Year 4. My hands trembled. Edward had written letters for me to read after he was gone, one every year. I untied the first ribbon. The earliest letter began simply, "My beautiful Frankie, if you're reading this, you've survived our first year apart." Tears immediately blurred the page. Edward continued, "I know you probably believe I'm writing to comfort you. You're wrong. I'm writing because I know you'll eventually begin doubting yourself. When grief lasts long enough, people start wondering whether they remembered everything correctly. You will remember us correctly." I smiled through tears. That had already happened countless times. Had Edward really said those words? Had he really smiled that way? Memory plays cruel tricks after loss. Yet somehow, he had anticipated even that. I continued reading. Most of the letter wasn't about money or secrets. It was about life. He reminded me to keep volunteering at the library, to continue buying fresh flowers every spring, to visit the Oregon coast every October, to never stop teaching even after retirement. Near the end, however, one paragraph caught my attention. "If someone begins asking unusual questions about my paperwork, don't argue, don't accuse, simply watch. People reveal themselves more clearly when they believe no one is watching them." I slowly lowered the letter. Edward hadn't instructed me to confront anyone. He wanted me to observe, to let the truth emerge naturally. The second letter contained more personal memories. The third reflected on forgiveness. The fourth spoke about Emma. Every letter felt like another conversation we never had the chance to finish. Hours seemed to disappear. By the time I reached the bundle labeled Year 4, sunlight had shifted across the office floor. This letter was different. Its envelope carried another note. "Read only if you already know someone searched the books." My heartbeat quickened. I carefully opened it. "Francis, if you've reached this letter, then my fears were probably justified. Please remember something before you become angry with Michael." I stopped, not surprised, disappointed. Edward had known, or at least suspected. I continued, "Our son has a generous heart. He also carries a dangerous weakness. He mistakes responsibility for control. If fear ever convinces him that he alone must protect everyone, he may begin making decisions that aren't his to make." Those words struck me with painful accuracy. Edward wasn't describing a criminal. He was describing the son we had raised, a man who genuinely believed he was helping even while violating trust. Near the bottom of the page, another folded note appeared. This one wasn't addressed to me. Across the front, Edward had written, "For Michael." I stared at it. The envelope remained sealed. Richard knocked softly before stepping back inside. "Everything all right?" I nodded. "My husband left a letter for our son." Richard smiled gently. "I thought he might." "You knew?" "I knew there was one. I never read it. He instructed that only you could decide when Michael should receive it." I carefully turned the envelope over in my hands. It felt strangely heavy despite containing only paper. "What if I never give it to him?" Richard answered without hesitation. "Then that will be your decision. Not Edward's, not Michael's, Mine. For the first time since coming to the bank, I realized what Edward had truly left behind. Not wealth, not hidden property, not secret investments. He had left me choices. He trusted me to decide what happened next. As I carefully returned the letters to the box, something slid from beneath the final bundle. A single folded document. Not a letter. A notarized agreement. Across the top in bold print were the words, "Family Integrity Statement" below it. Edward had written one sentence by hand. Money can be inherited, character cannot. I unfolded the document slowly, knowing that whatever came next would change the course of our family forever. I sat alone in my living room long after I returned from the bank. The gray metal box rested on the coffee table beside Edward's journal. Outside rain washed over the windows in steady waves, but inside the house everything felt strangely still. I unfolded the family integrity statement once more. It wasn't a will, it wasn't a trust. It wasn't even a legal contract in the traditional sense. It was something far more personal. Edward had written a short introduction in his own handwriting before the notarized pages began. If you are reading this, Frankie, then you've already learned that people sometimes chase answers for the wrong reasons. This document is not meant to punish anyone. It is meant to remind our family that trust is easier to lose than money and much harder to earn back. I slowly continued reading. The statement described the principles Edward wanted to guide our family's future. Every financial decision should be discussed openly. No one should pressure another family member into signing legal documents. Property should never become more important than relationships. And finally, one sentence was typed in bold letters. Any future changes to family assets should occur only after full and voluntary discussion with Francis Hayes. Edward had signed it. Charles Bennett had signed it. A notary had signed it. Legally, it wasn't a deed, but emotionally, it was unmistakable. Edward had anticipated that one day I might be pressured into making decisions that weren't truly my own. He hadn't tried to control the future. He had simply written down the values he hoped would survive him. As I carefully folded the document, my eyes drifted toward the unopened envelope addressed to Michael. I picked it up. It weighed almost nothing. A single sheet of paper, perhaps two. How could something so light feel so heavy? I turned it over several times before placing it back into the box. Not yet. Edward had trusted me to decide the right moment. I intended to honor that trust. The following afternoon, I called Michael. "Would you and Rebecca come for dinner tomorrow evening?" He sounded pleasantly surprised. "Of course. Just family. We'll be there. And bring Emma." "I will." When I ended the call, I immediately phoned Emma. She answered on the second ring. "Grandma, I have a favor to ask." "Anything." "When you come tomorrow?" "Yes. I want you to tell the truth." She became very quiet. "What do you mean?" "Nothing more. Nothing less." Another long silence. Finally she whispered, "I've been wanting to." The next day passed more slowly than any I could remember. I cooked Edward's favorite meal: pot roast, mashed potatoes, roasted carrots, fresh biscuits, apple pie. The same menu I had prepared every year on his birthday. The familiar smells filled the house. For the first time since my books had disappeared, my home felt alive again. Just before 6 o'clock, Emma arrived first. She hugged me tightly. "You look tired." I smiled. "I've been reading." She laughed softly. "Grandpa always said books keep people awake." They certainly kept me awake this week. A few minutes later, Michael and Rebecca walked in carrying flowers and a bottle of sparkling cider. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Too normal. We sat around the dining table. Conversation remained light through dinner. Emma talked about school. Rebecca discussed a new real estate listing. Michael mentioned work. No one brought up Edward. No one mentioned the journal. No one mentioned the books. After dessert, I stood and quietly carried the gray metal box into the dining room. All three pairs of eyes immediately followed it. I placed it gently in the center of the table. Michael's shoulders stiffened. Rebecca's smile disappeared. Emma looked at me with quiet understanding. "I went to the bank yesterday." No one spoke. I met Richard Collins. Michael blinked. The old banker. Yes. He'd been waiting for me. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I continued calmly. Edward left something there, Michael swallowed. What was it? I looked directly at him. Letters. His expression changed. Not relief, confusion. Letters. One for every year after he passed away. Rebecca frowned. That's all? That was enough. Michael looked down at the table. What did Dad say? He talked about grief. He talked about forgiveness. He talked about books. I paused. And he talked about fear. Michael slowly lifted his head. He wrote something about me, didn't he? I nodded. He did. Rebecca leaned forward. What exactly? I ignored her question. Instead, I reached into the box and removed the sealed envelope with Michael's name on it. His eyes locked onto it instantly. Edward's handwriting still looked fresh despite the years. For Michael. I held the envelope in both hands. Your father left this for you. Michael stared without moving. Rebecca whispered, Open it. I looked at my daughter-in-law. No. She looked surprised. It belongs to Michael. It does. So let him read it. I will. I turned back toward my son. But before I give it to you, I need to ask one question. Michael nodded silently. I took a slow breath. Why did you search my books? The room became perfectly still. Even the ticking clock on the wall suddenly sounded louder. Michael didn't answer. Rebecca spoke instead. We've already discussed, no. My voice remained calm. I asked my son. Another silence. Finally, Michael spoke. I thought Dad left something. What? I wasn't sure. What did you believe? He hesitated. Then almost in a whisper he answered. Property papers. The Montana land. His eyes widened. You knew. I know more than you think. He leaned back slowly. I heard stories growing up. What stories? That Grandpa never sold everything. That Dad protected part of it. I thought... His voice cracked. I thought he wanted me to find it. I looked at him for a long time. No. He wanted you to find yourself. Michael frowned. I don't understand. You searched every book. You searched the attic. You searched hidden compartments. You searched memories. But did you ever stop and ask why your father left those clues in the first place? His face slowly lost color. Rebecca suddenly interrupted. There has to be more. There isn't. She shook her head. People don't create all those puzzles for nothing. They do if they're trying to teach. Rebecca laughed nervously. No. There must be another document. Another box. Another account. Michael remained silent. I watched his face carefully. For the first time since this nightmare began, he wasn't looking at the envelope. He was looking at me. Really looking. As though seeing the hurt in my eyes for the first time. Then, from beside him, Emma quietly spoke. There is something I need to say. All three of us turned toward her. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. Dad. She looked directly at Michael. I saw you. Michael froze. I saw you taking pages out of Grandpa's journal. Rebecca immediately shook her head. Emma. No. Emma's voice became stronger. I also saw both of you opening Grandma's books. I watched you throw away her photographs because you thought they were hiding something. Tears filled Michael's eyes. Rebecca opened her mouth to object again. But this time Michael gently raised a hand. No. His voice barely rose above a whisper. She's telling the truth. The room fell silent. Not because the mystery had finally been solved, but because for the first time the truth had spoken without fear. And I knew that whatever happened next would determine whether our family could ever become whole again. No one spoke for several seconds after Michael admitted Emma was telling the truth. The silence felt heavier than any argument could have. Rebecca stared at him in disbelief. You can't be serious. Michael didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the tabletop as though he finally understood that there was nowhere left to hide. I am. His voice was quiet. So she's right? I asked. About everything. He slowly nodded. Yes. Rebecca pushed her chair back. Michael, don't do this. He closed his eyes. I already did it. She stood abruptly. We came here to have dinner, not to be interrogated. No, Michael said softly. We came here because Mom deserves the truth. Rebecca looked from him to me. You don't have to explain anything. I do. You'll make everything worse. I already have. She grabbed her purse. I'm not sitting here for this. Before she reached the front door, Emma quietly spoke. Mom. Rebecca stopped. Emma's eyes were filled with tears. Please don't leave. Rebecca hesitated but didn't turn around. I've spent months pretending nothing was wrong. Emma swallowed hard. I'm tired. Those simple words carried more weight than anger ever could. Rebecca slowly returned to her chair without saying another word. Michael looked at me. I don't expect you to forgive me. I know. I don't even expect you to understand. I'll decide that after I hear everything. He nodded. Then, for the first time in his life, my son began speaking to me, not as a successful professional, not as a husband or a father, but as a frightened little boy who had lost his way. It started almost 2 years ago. I remained silent. Rebecca's brother Kevin came to our house one weekend. I recognized the name. Kevin Foster. Always chasing business opportunities, always convinced he'd discovered the next big investment. He asked me something strange. Michael rubbed his forehead. He wanted to know whether Grandpa Hayes had ever owned land in Montana. I felt my pulse quicken. I told him Grandpa Francis's father had owned some land years ago. He laughed. Michael looked embarrassed. He said old ranch property in that area had become incredibly valuable. Rebecca interrupted quietly. Kevin works with commercial developers. I nodded but said nothing. Michael continued. A few weeks later, Kevin called again. He said he'd been researching county records. He claimed there were inconsistencies. What kind of inconsistencies? He couldn't find a complete transfer history. Michael sighed heavily. He convinced me the land had never actually been sold. I thought back to Charles asking about Montana. Edward had known this rumor might eventually surface. I asked Dad once. Michael looked toward the fireplace. It was maybe 8 years ago. What did he say? He smiled. And, he said, Michael gave a sad little laugh. Some things are worth more when people stop looking for them. I remembered that conversation. Edward had been pruning the roses outside while Michael visited with Emma. At the time, I thought he had been talking about memories. Michael had heard something entirely different. I couldn't stop thinking about it, he continued. Then Kevin started putting pieces together. What pieces? Dad loved puzzles. He built hidden compartments. He collected old maps. He kept journals. He handled Grandpa's paperwork. Kevin believed none of that was a coincidence. He became convinced Dad had hidden the proof somewhere. Rebecca finally spoke. I told Michael not to ignore the possibility. I looked at her. You encouraged him. She lowered her eyes. I thought. Her voice weakened. If there really was property worth millions, it belonged to Michael. Not to me. She looked ashamed. I wasn't thinking clearly. No, you weren't. Michael continued before I could say anything more. At first, I only searched the attic. I thought Dad might have left legal files. When I didn't find anything, Kevin suggested the library. The books. He nodded. He said Dad would never hide something in an obvious place. So you opened every one? Yes. My chest tightened. The photographs. I thought documents might be behind them. The letters. I thought they were covering something. The pressed flowers. I was desperate. His voice cracked. I wasn't thinking about what they meant to you. I was thinking about what Dad might have hidden. Emma quietly wiped tears from her face. I asked you why you were taking Grandma's things. Michael closed his eyes. I remember. You told me it was a treasure hunt. I know. You lied. I did. Rebecca reached for Michael's hand. He gently pulled it away. No. I have to say this myself. He looked directly at me. The day you went into surgery, I came here. I told myself I was protecting our future. Our future. He nodded. I convinced myself that if I found those papers first, I could make sure no one else ever took advantage of you. I stared at him. So stealing my privacy became protecting me. Fresh tears filled his eyes. When you say it like that, because that's what it was. He nodded slowly. I know. The room fell silent again. Finally, I asked the question that had haunted me from the beginning. What about the journal? Michael let out a long breath. Kevin thought Dad used it as an index. He believed every clue started there. But you left it on the shelf. He looked surprised. You noticed. I noticed everything. He gave a faint, painful smile. I was afraid to take it. Why? Because if you noticed it missing, you'd know someone had been searching. So instead, I hoped you'd ignore it. I almost laughed. Edward had predicted that perfectly. Michael had left the journal because he believed it was too obvious, exactly as Edward intended. And the hidden compartment? I asked quietly. Michael's face paled. You found it. I asked the question. He nodded. I found it. What was inside? Nothing. Nothing. He shook his head. An empty space. I thought someone had beaten me to it. You didn't find the second compartment. His eyebrows rose. There was another one. I said nothing. The realization spread slowly across his face. Then he covered his mouth with one trembling hand. Oh, Dad. His voice broke completely. I never understood. I realized then that Michael truly had searched the shelves. He had even discovered the first hidden compartment. But he had stopped the moment he found it empty. He never questioned whether Edward, the meticulous architect, might have hidden another layer behind the first. Because he wasn't following Edward's thinking. He was chasing money. Edward had designed every clue for someone searching for truth, not treasure. Rebecca looked between us. So, there really isn't any property. I slowly reached into the gray box and removed the family integrity statement. Then I looked at both of them. The greatest inheritance Edward left behind wasn't land. It wasn't money. It wasn't a hidden account. It was the chance to discover who we become when we think no one is watching. Michael lowered his head. I failed. No, I spoke gently. You revealed who you had become. He looked up confused. There's a difference. Outside, the rain finally stopped. A ray of evening sunlight slipped through the dining room window and landed across Edward's journal resting quietly on the shelf. For the first time since this began, I understood exactly why my husband had left it there. He never expected the journal to protect an inheritance. He expected it to expose character. And without realizing it, my son had answered every question his father had left behind. No one moved for several moments. The evening sunlight rested across Edward's journal like a quiet spotlight illuminating the one object that had quietly guided us to this moment. Michael remained seated with his hands clasped together. He looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. The confidence he had carried for months was gone, replaced by something I hadn't seen in him since he was a little boy who accidentally broke his first bicycle and cried because he thought he had disappointed his father. I never wanted to hurt you. His voice was barely audible. I know. He looked surprised. You do. I know you never woke up one morning planning to betray me. I leaned back in my chair. Most betrayals don't begin that way. Rebecca quietly wiped tears from her cheeks. I'm sorry too. I looked at her. For what? She hesitated. For encouraging him. I kept telling myself we were protecting our future. But the truth is, she struggled to continue. I stopped seeing this house as your home. I started seeing it as an asset. Her honesty hurt. But dishonesty would have hurt even more. I appreciate you saying that. She lowered her eyes. I don't expect forgiveness. I nodded gently. Forgiveness isn't something anyone earns in a single conversation. Emma reached across the table and quietly took my hand. I'm sorry, Grandma. I squeezed her fingers. You have nothing to apologize for. I should have told you sooner. You told me when you were ready. She smiled through tears. I was scared. I know. And I'm proud of you anyway. Her shoulders relaxed. Edward always believed courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing honesty despite fear. Emma had inherited that part of him. I slowly picked up the sealed envelope addressed to Michael. Every eye in the room followed it. This belongs to you. I slid it across the table. Michael looked at it but didn't touch it. I don't deserve it. Perhaps not. Then why give it to me? Because your father trusted me to decide. And I've decided. His hands trembled as he finally picked up the envelope. He stared at Edward's familiar handwriting for several long seconds before carefully opening it. Inside was a single handwritten page. Michael began reading silently. Halfway down the page, his breathing changed. His eyes filled with tears. He stopped, closed his eyes, then started reading again from the beginning. Finally, he whispered, he knew. No one answered. He knew exactly what I would become. I quietly held out my hand. May I? Michael nodded and passed me the letter. Edward's words were unmistakably gentle. My dear Michael, if this letter reaches you, then life has probably become more complicated than either of us hoped. First, let me tell you something that has always been true. I have never doubted your intelligence. I have never doubted your work ethic. I have only worried that one day you might confuse providing for your family with controlling the people you love. I paused. Every word described the man sitting across from me. Edward continued. You inherited my determination. Unfortunately, you also inherited my stubbornness. If you are reading this after searching my books, then I need you to understand something. The thing you were looking for never existed. Michael quietly covered his face. Rebecca began crying openly. I continued reading aloud. The rumors about hidden land, the stories about secret papers, the whispered conversations. I allowed them to continue. Not because I wanted anyone to suffer, because I wanted to learn whether my family valued trust more than possibility. I looked up. Michael wasn't crying because he had lost money. He was crying because he finally understood. Edward had never tested his intelligence. He had tested his priorities. I finished the letter. If you have reached this point, then you have probably disappointed yourself. Please don't waste the rest of your life trying to recover imaginary wealth. Spend it rebuilding real relationships. Your mother will never need your perfection. She will only ever need your honesty. Love, Dad. When I finished reading, the room remained silent. No one had anything left to argue about. The truth had already done all the work. Several minutes passed before Michael finally spoke. I destroyed memories. His voice cracked. For something that wasn't even real. You did. I threw away photographs. Yes. I invaded your home. Yes. I lied to Emma. His daughter quietly nodded. I even questioned Dad after he was gone. I reached across the table and rested my hand over his. You questioned yourself. That's what hurts. He looked at me with tears streaming down his face. I became someone Dad tried to warn me about. No. I gently shook my head. You became someone who forgot what mattered. There's a difference, he frowned. Is there? Yes. If this had been who you truly are, I looked toward Emma. Your daughter wouldn't still love you. I looked at Rebecca. Your wife wouldn't still be sitting beside you. Finally, I looked back into my son's eyes. And your father wouldn't have written you a letter full of hope. Michael quietly cried. Not dramatic sobs, just the quiet tears of someone mourning the person they thought they had become. After a while, he reached into his jacket pocket. I need to show you something. He placed a folded piece of paper on the table. I found this months ago. I unfolded it carefully. It was one of the missing pages from Edward's journal. Michael lowered his head. I couldn't understand it. The page contained only one sentence. Character is revealed long before consequences arrive. I smiled sadly. You thought it was another clue. I did. It was. He looked confused. To what? To exactly this moment. He stared at the page for a long time. Then something unexpected happened. He stood, walked into the library, and slowly began carrying empty storage boxes back into the room. Rebecca looked puzzled. "What are you doing?" Without turning around, he answered quietly, "Tomorrow morning." He lifted another empty box. "I'm bringing every one of Mom's books home." I watched him carefully. Not because I believed one gesture could erase months of betrayal. It couldn't. But because for the first time in a very long while my son wasn't searching for something hidden. He was trying to return something he had taken away. And perhaps that was where healing truly begins. Not when trust is fully restored, but when someone finally stops looking for treasure and starts rebuilding what they broke. The next morning I woke to the sound of a truck backing into my driveway. For one brief, confused moment, I thought I had dreamed everything that happened the night before. Then I looked out my bedroom window. Michael stood beside a rented moving truck. Emma climbed out of the passenger seat wearing jeans work gloves and one of Edward's old baseball caps that I had given her years ago. Rebecca stepped out more slowly. She looked nervous. No one knocked immediately. Instead, all three of them waited on the front porch until I opened the door. Michael held out his house key. "I don't think I should have this anymore." I looked down at the small silver key resting in his palm. It had hung on his keychain for almost 20 years. I gently closed his fingers around it. "Keep it." He looked surprised. "I thought I gave you that key because you're my son." I paused. "I'm not taking it back." His eyes filled with emotion. "But understand something. I won't ever use it without asking again." "I know." He nodded once. "I promise." That promise meant more to me than any legal document ever could. Michael turned toward the moving truck. "We have a lot of work to do." For the next 6 hours, we carried box after box back into the house. No one complained, no one rushed. Every carton felt less like furniture and more like an apology. Emma insisted on carrying the lighter boxes herself. "I know where most of these go," she smiled. "Grandpa taught me the alphabet by shelving books." I laughed. "I remember. He said libraries have their own language." "They do." She looked around the empty room. "I think he'd like seeing this." "So do I." Michael carefully lifted one shelf of history books. Before placing them back, he stopped. "I'm sorry." I looked at him. "Not just for moving them." He swallowed. "I'm sorry for treating them like objects." I smiled sadly. Every family has something they protect. Some families collect paintings, others jewelry. Our family collected stories. He nodded. "I forgot." "No," I corrected gently. "You stopped paying attention." There was a difference. Rebecca quietly unpacked the novels. As she opened one box, an old photograph slipped onto the floor. She immediately froze. It was the picture of 9-year-old Michael holding his first Little League trophy. The same photograph I believed had disappeared forever. She slowly picked it up. Her voice broke. "I found this inside one of the books." She looked ashamed. "I meant to put it back. But I kept thinking I'd do it tomorrow." There were dozens like this. I accepted the photograph carefully. The corners had bent slightly, but otherwise it was untouched. I smiled at the little boy in the picture. He looked so proud. Edward stood beside him with one hand resting on his shoulder. "I remember that day." Michael smiled faintly. "I struck out twice. You also caught the final fly ball." I cried afterward. "You thought we'd be disappointed." He laughed quietly through tears. "Dad bought me ice cream. He said courage wasn't about winning." I nodded. "He said courage was showing up again after failure." The room grew quiet. Michael looked at the photograph again. "I wish I'd remembered that before all this." "So do I." By late afternoon, nearly every shelf had been filled again. The library no longer echoed. The walls felt warm once more. Books have a curious way of changing a room without making a sound. Helen Carter wandered over from next door carrying fresh lemonade. She stopped in the doorway. "My goodness," she smiled broadly. It finally looks like home again. It feels like home again. She hugged me tightly before looking around. Edward's favorite reading chair stood back beside the window. The globe he had inherited from his father rested beside the fireplace. Every familiar detail seemed to breathe again. Helen turned toward Michael. "I've been waiting a long time to see you carry those boxes back." Michael looked embarrassed. "I deserved that." She smiled kindly. "No. You deserve the chance to fix it." Those words stayed with me. People often believe consequences end a story. Sometimes they simply begin a better one. As evening approached, Charles Bennett arrived carrying several legal folders. I figured today would be a good day. I invited him inside. Michael immediately stood. "Mr. Bennett." Charles nodded politely. "Michael." The atmosphere remained respectful but cautious. Charles placed the folders on my dining room table. "Francis, I've prepared everything you requested." Michael looked confused. "What is it?" I answered before Charles could. "My estate plan." Silence settled over the room. Rebecca lowered her eyes. "I expected that." "I imagine you did." I opened the first folder. My previous will divided everything equally. I looked at Michael. "That document no longer reflects what I believe is best." He nodded slowly. "I understand." Charles quietly explained each revision. The house would remain mine for the rest of my life. After my passing, it would not automatically be sold. Instead, the property would become the permanent home of a literacy foundation dedicated to providing free books, tutoring, and reading programs for children throughout the community. Edward Hayes Literacy Foundation. The name alone brought tears to my eyes. Michael stared at the documents. "You started a foundation." "I am." "Why?" I smiled. "Because your father spent his entire life believing books change people." He was right. Emma's eyes sparkled. "Can I help?" I looked at Charles. He smiled knowingly. "I was hoping you'd ask." I handed Emma another folder. Inside was a simple letter. "Junior Advisory Board." Emma looked completely stunned. "What is this?" "I'd like you to help choose programs, recommend books, meet young readers, share your ideas." Her eyes filled with happy tears. "Really? If you're willing." She threw her arms around me. "I'd love to." Michael watched quietly. I noticed. He hesitated. "My name isn't anywhere." "No," I answered honestly. "Not yet." He nodded. "I understand." I reached across the table. "You don't need a title. You need time." He looked at me carefully. "I don't know if I'll ever deserve your trust again." "You won't." His face fell. Then I smiled gently. "You'll earn it. One ordinary day at a time. No shortcuts. No speeches. No promises. Just choices." He slowly nodded. "I can do that." "I hope so." Before leaving, Michael walked into the library alone. I watched from the doorway as he carefully adjusted one slightly crooked book until it aligned perfectly with the others. A tiny gesture, meaningless to anyone else, everything to me. Because months earlier he had searched those shelves looking for hidden wealth. Now he was protecting them simply because they mattered. As he turned off the library light, he quietly whispered something toward Edward's old reading chair. "I'm still learning, Dad." I don't know whether Edward would have answered, but somehow, standing in that room filled once again with stories, I believed he would have smiled. Healing, I discovered, rarely arrives all at once. It comes quietly. One ordinary conversation, one honest apology, one faithful choice at a time. By the beginning of autumn, my house no longer felt like a place that had survived betrayal. It felt like a home that had learned from it. Every bookshelf had been restored. Every novel stood where Edward had carefully placed it years earlier. The family photographs Michael had recovered from the storage boxes were tucked safely back inside their familiar pages. The pressed maple leaf from our honeymoon rested, once again, inside my worn copy of Little Women. The newspaper clipping from my retirement ceremony had returned to Hamlet. The birthday card Edward wrote on our 20th anniversary waited patiently inside, Pride and Prejudice. One by one, our memories found their way home. Some could never be replaced. Others had been bent or faded. But somehow they felt even more precious than before. Perhaps broken things often teach us how much they matter. Every Saturday afternoon, children from the neighborhood gathered in my living room. The Edward Hayes Literacy Foundation had officially opened its first community reading program. We didn't begin with grand speeches, we began with stories. Some children came because they loved books. Others came because they simply wanted a quiet place after school. A few admitted they had never owned a book before. Watching them choose their first novel reminded me of why I had become a teacher all those years ago. Books don't merely entertain us. They quietly introduce us to better versions of ourselves. Emma became the heart of the foundation. She organized reading circles for younger children. She recommended books with surprising wisdom for someone only 16 years old. She even created a tradition called Grandpa's Shelf. Every month, she selected one of Edward's favorite novels and shared the story behind why he loved it. The children adored those afternoons. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they cried, sometimes they simply listened. I often caught myself smiling from across the room. Edward would have loved every minute. Michael kept his promise. He never asked about property again. He never mentioned Montana. He never searched another drawer shelf or attic. Instead, every Wednesday evening after work, he arrived carrying a toolbox. Without making a fuss, he repaired whatever needed fixing around the house. A loose cabinet hinge, a leaking faucet, a squeaky porch step. He never accepted money. He never expected praise. One afternoon, I found him quietly sanding one of Edward's old bookshelves. I noticed the finish wearing off. I stood beside him. You know, he looked up. I finally understand why Dad built these himself. Why? Because they weren't furniture. They were promises, I smiled. What kind of promises? That knowledge deserves a home. He carefully brushed away the sawdust. And that families should too. I placed my hand on his shoulder. I've missed talking to you. I've missed being someone worth talking to. You never stopped being my son. He looked away. I stopped acting like one. There was no defense left in his voice. Only humility. That I had learned was where real change begins. Rebecca also changed in ways I hadn't expected. She volunteered to help organize fundraising events for the Literacy Foundation. At first, I wondered whether guilt motivated her. Perhaps it did. But over time, something deeper replaced guilt. One afternoon, she stayed after everyone had gone home. She carefully dusted the bookshelves before quietly saying, "I used to think success meant collecting more." She looked around the room. "Now I think success might be protecting what already matters." I nodded. "It took me a long time to learn that too." She smiled. "Thank you for giving me the chance." "I didn't." She looked confused. "Edward did." She laughed softly. "I suppose he did." Charles Bennett retired that winter. Before leaving his office for the last time, he visited the foundation, carrying one final gift: Edward's old drafting compass. "I've been holding on to this." He placed it in my hands. He wanted it displayed somewhere children could see it. We framed it beside a photograph of Edward standing in front of the bookshelves he built. Beneath the photograph, Emma suggested a simple plaque: "Build shelves, fill hearts." It sounded exactly like something Edward would have said. Late one October afternoon, after the last child had gone home, I finally found myself alone in the library. Golden sunlight filtered through the windows, covering the books with a warm glow. Outside, maple leaves drifted across the front yard. Our season. I walked slowly to the middle bookshelf. The leather journal rested exactly where it had always belonged. I picked it up one final time. Its pages no longer felt mysterious. I understood them now. The invisible messages, the hidden compartments, the carefully planned clues, none of them had protected money. They had protected something far more valuable: choice. Edward never forced anyone to become honest. He simply created opportunities for truth to reveal itself. Michael had chosen greed. Then he chose repentance. Emma chose courage. Rebecca chose humility, and I chose to leave room for redemption. I gently returned the journal to its place on the shelf. Exactly where Edward wanted it. Exactly where Michael had once feared it. Exactly where it had quietly waited for all of us to become ready. As I turned off the library light, I noticed one final sentence written inside the back cover that I somehow hadn't seen before. Perhaps I simply hadn't been ready. It read, "The greatest story I ever wrote wasn't inside this journal. It was the family still learning how to love each other after the final chapter." I smiled through grateful tears. For months, I had believed the journal was hiding a secret. In the end, it had revealed one instead. There is no inheritance greater than trust, no fortune richer than forgiveness, and no library more valuable than a home where every story, even the painful ones, can finally be told with honesty. I closed the journal gently. Then I walked toward the laughter waiting downstairs. Because life, unlike books, always gives us one more page to write,